Alrighty. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Nick Silva, and like Joan said, I'm a senior environmental scientist with California State Parks. Instead of a specific restoration project, today I'm going to be kind of overviewing a multi-year initiative which leverages a lot of the data hubs that we've already heard about today to advance our statewide identification and assessment of estuarine resources as distributed across California's state park system. So state parks stewards over 1.6 million acres of wilderness across California, including about a third of the entire California coastline. And you can see here our agency's mission, and we're a little unique in that we're obligated to provide opportunities for educational, recreational, and cultural enrichment, but are also directly tasked with preserving California's extraordinary biodiversity and protecting its most valued natural resources. Organizationally, this mandate is driven by our natural resources staff. Most report to local district offices, but the department also maintains a statewide headquarters team, which works on select issues that span the entire department, including some of the estuaries work I'm going to discuss today. Now, I'm sure we're all aware, California's estuaries are incredibly important ecosystems, which have been dramatically impacted by coastal urbanization. And in managing just a shy of a third of the California coast, under that directive to preserve natural space and limit development, it's not particularly surprising that state parks has a major role to play as a landowner and manager of estuarine habitat across California. But that said, the majority of in-house information regarding our estuarine resources associated with our parklands was historically siloed within our district offices or as institutional knowledge that was held by those expert field staff. And so in 2019-ish, our statewide headquarters office set out to compile estuarine resources data into a general inventory to inform data-driven management at the statewide scale. To do so, we developed a general estuary assessment framework, which is comprised of two major components, data development, as well as partnerships and outreach, and a bunch of subcomponents. Our data development subcomponents include a series of surveys with expert field staff, as well as geospatial desktop analysis and a workshop series with external partners. And this was complemented by our partnerships and outreach project areas, which include staff trainings, technical support for staff and projects, participation in work groups and partnerships like PMEP, and funding for research addressing key management and science questions. For the purpose of today's discussion, I'm just going to touch on the staff survey results a little bit, and we'll primarily focus on our geospatial data development subproject. And I think it's just, again, worth kind of reiterating that, especially this data development subcomponent has historically been kind of a passion project led by a relatively small group of staff and California Sea Grant Fellows. And so just an acknowledgement of the theme of today's workshop, I think it's just, again, kind of worth reiterating how this work was only possible because of the third party and external partner generated data resources that we were able to leverage to inform our internal efforts. So, fundamentally, our data development team started with a map of all 281 park units of the California State Park system. We then dug into the literature to identify all locations where terrestrial watersheds met the Pacific Ocean and crosswalked these locations with our park boundaries. This identified 255 unique coastal confluences that were affiliated with a state park unit. Once identified, we could then classify these confluences. We used two classification systems. The first we've already heard about, the Coastal Marine Ecological Classification Standard, or CMEX, the kind of federal standard. And then we also utilized a state park's tailored archetype classification nomenclature. And importantly, this let us subset out some non-estuarine systems, creek mouths, freshwater lagoons, and urban drains that weren't characterized by tidal exchange. This left us with barbelled estuaries, tidal wetland complexes, open river mouths, and embayment and bays. And we land on, a perhaps more accurate total of about 153 unique estuaries that are affiliated with 93 coastal park units. That means that 75% of all coastal units of the state park system are affiliated with an estuary. And it also lets us put a spotlight on the department's role as manager of these, small bar-built or intermittently closing estuaries, as this analysis suggests that 45% of all bar-built estuaries in California are associated with a state park unit. So once we had our list of estuaries, our next step was to gather some of that site-specific survey data. Perhaps not the most quantitative of methodologies, but it has proved to be a super valuable data set. Just a couple examples, one survey question asked staff to identify priority natural resource stressors for every estuary. Here you can see the top 15 identified statewide. I think the top two, which are development and infrastructure and invasive species, are pretty straightforward. But I do think it's interesting that public access was actually the third most frequently identified stressor, which really highlights the balancing act that our staff walk between the different components of our mission. In this case, providing that recreational access as well as resource conservation. Just one more example from the survey data, but we also asked staff to identify top management challenges at each estuary. Again, this is statewide responses, but worth noting that the foremost identified challenge is associated with the fact that state parks often only manages a portion of a given estuary. And so our limited jurisdiction means that managers have to rely on strong cross-boundary partnerships for effective conservation at the whole estuary scale. But realistically, at this point, we basically had a big Excel spreadsheet that was geo-referenced to a series of points. And so our next step was to develop our inventory from a point-based data set into a series of polygons so we could complement our qualitative survey data with more quantitative GIS analysis. To do so, we combined our estuary inventory point layer with land cover data from the National Wetlands Inventory, the California Aquatic Resources Inventory, which we've already heard about, as well as the PMEP current and historical extent data layer to generate current representative estuary boundary polygons for every one of our parks-affiliated estuary sites. We then took these polygons, QA/QC'd them internally, attributed them, sent us out to the local staff for a peer review, and published that layer internally across our organizational ArcGIS infrastructure. For the rest of this talk, I'm just going to kind of run through some statewide case studies highlighting how this data can be applied at the statewide scale. But I also want to note that this is a resource that has been accessed, at this point, nearly 1,000 times by state park staff. And so, it not only advances our ability to articulate our role in estuarine resources management at the statewide scale, but also informs, regional and local planning and project efforts. So through the exercise, we identified over 26,000 acres of estuary habitat. A bit less than 10,000 of those acres actually fall within the boundaries of the state park system. Again, kind of highlighting the importance of developing strong local cross-boundary partnerships to advance effective stewardship at the estuary scale. So just a couple examples, we can cross-reference each polygon with the statewide CARI land cover data to better articulate the breakdown of different habitat types across our parks-affiliated estuaries. And then we can also rerun this analysis for the portions of each estuary within our jurisdiction to better understand the distribution of wetland features within our department. The top two reported habitat types here are subtidal water and tidal marsh, not necessarily super surprising. But I do think it's interesting that the third highest acreage reported was eelgrass and submerged aquatic vegetation. And this result is an interesting case study in the application of this workflow, as of the over 4,000 acres of SAV habitat identified in CARI, less than 2% of that acreage was actually identified within state parks' borders. And so, we can dive into this. There's a couple likely explanations. First, state parks tends to have pretty minimal ownership of subtidal waters in some of the larger park-affiliated California bays that harbor large SAV populations. Similarly, we've also discussed how a lot of state parks affiliated estuaries are these very small bar-built estuaries. And so, those may not have the requisite environmental conditions to support persistent or perennial SAV species. They may be better characterized by more intermittent annuals, things like rupia or widgeon grass, which are much more poorly mapped and less represented in statewide databases. And then another likely factor is also just that state parks has almost no substantive in-water harbor or marina facilities within our estuarine lands. And so because of this, there's very limited in-water construction work and consequently very little mandated surveying and mapping of SAV habitat within state parks managed lands, for compensatory mitigation and restoration purposes. So department policy also dissuades using state park system lands for mitigation of non-department projects. So our neighbors may also be unlikely to include state parks areas in local mapping. And so, just this analysis suggests that, those SAV populations may be undersurveyed and underreported in, the over 4,000 acres of subtidal estuarine waters within the boundaries of California state parks. And future efforts could include application of habitat suitability models, subsequent field validation to better understand our role in conservation of these critical habitats. Transitioning to another example, again, given staff surveys identifying coastal development and infrastructure as key estuary management challenges and resource stressors, we can also leverage external data resources, in this case, the National Land Cover Database, to assess the extent of development within our estuaries. Visualized here is relative land cover distribution by NLCD classification. The dots represent the percent of each land cover within a given area, with black dots representing the subsection of each department-affiliated estuary within our jurisdiction, and the pattern-filled dots symbolizing the affiliated estuary portion that falls outside of the boundaries of the affiliated state park unit. Notably, when we look across land cover classes, we see that areas within the overall estuary boundary, but outside of state parks' jurisdiction, are characterized by a higher percent of developed and agricultural land cover, while conversely, areas within the boundaries of the state park system are characterized by a much higher percent of undeveloped land. So, tying back to the intent of this work, this type of analysis advances a couple goals. It quantitatively supports assertions. Nope. That I'll give it a second for the mute. Appreciate it. Thank you. So first, it quantitatively supports assertions that state parks is responsible for stewarding disproportionately undeveloped estuarine habitat across California. And concurrently, this data can also be analyzed on an estuary by estuary scale to identify areas within our jurisdiction that have disproportionately high rates of development, which can then be prioritized in future habitat restoration efforts. We can also use similar workflows to look within the buffer area for each park's affiliated estuary. Visualized here is a 250-meter buffer around each polygon. Again, we see the components of the estuary buffer that fall outside of state parks are characterized by a higher percentage of developed lands, while the buffer area within state parks is characterized by a much higher proportion of undeveloped lands. Again, this can be investigated at a site-specific scale to identify opportunities for restoration of buffer habitat. And at the statewide scale, it provides further validation of assumptions regarding state parks' disproportionate role in not only preserving undeveloped estuarine habitat, but also providing native landscapes for marsh migration, transitional habitat, unimpeded hydrologic and geomorphic processes, and wildlife corridors. Just kind of speaking of wildlife and a couple other data hubs, we can also crosswalk our boundary data with the California Natural Diversity Database, which is a data hub consolidating special status species observation data across California. In doing so, we identify at least 325 unique special status species across our affiliated estuaries. I'm a little low on time, so I'm not going to do a super deep dive into this analysis, but I think a notable takeaway is that even though our jurisdiction only covers around 39% of the total acreage of this estuary data set, over 91% of all special status species observed at the whole estuary scale also occur within department-managed estuary subsections. We can also leverage EcoAtlas and that CRAM data that we heard about earlier today to look at field survey results. We identified over 286 CRAM surveys conducted within our affiliated estuaries, and preliminary results indicate that CRAM assessment areas score significantly higher when the assessment area is located within the boundaries of the state park system, rather than similar assessments conducted in affiliated areas outside of our jurisdiction. It also gives us a super useful estuary by estuary condition metric, which can inform future workflows. And also I want to note that while this is interesting, it's a very incomplete data set. Only around 47% of all state parks associated estuaries have received a CRAM assessment. So this workflow is also useful in identifying data gaps in areas to prioritize future in situ monitoring and assessment efforts. Finally, just closing with one more slightly more applied example. We're currently collaborating with nonprofit partners to identify anadromous fish habitat as well as passage barriers across our parklands. So again, using a bunch of the data hubs that I've already discussed, we identified the presence and distribution of key anadromous fish species across state park system affiliated estuaries. And then we crosswalked our estuary layer with the California Fish Passage Assessment Database to identify estuary passage barriers. This identified 48 potential barriers in department affiliated estuaries, including 16 within our managed lands. And so this information can then be relayed, to our field teams for further investigation and potential remediation. So I'll stop there for now. This has been an ongoing passion project, and preliminary results presented here are really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of, how these data sets can be used. And then again, ultimately, this work fundamentally would not have been possible without the work conducted by partners at organizations like the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, USGS, PMEP, San Francisco Estuary Institute, or the generosity and support of our state parks colleagues. So I hope this was an interesting case study, and I'm happy to address any questions if I have any time remaining.